Okay, so we are back to do some more, and I normally do these in my like reading area, but Wayne is asleep in there, so I have to do it in here. And you want to laugh, this top, believe it or not, is I froze there for a second. These are actually leggings that I converted into a top. These are the legs, and the waistband is down here. So you just take the leggings and you cut out the crotch, and it becomes where your head goes through, and you've got a little crop top. It's very comfortable. So these were a set of leggings that I didn't like the length. They were too capri, and I like leggings to go all the way down, but they were that super soft LuLaRoe, so I just made a top out of them. The more you know. Okay, so we're continuing with January 1973, and I am super enjoying this book because it is so tying in what we are learning with LP history during this time frame and what we learned, it's supplementing from Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972. So we did the intro, and right now we're in Prelude, and the title of the Prelude is The Very Thought of Losing is Hateful to Americans. And it goes back to 1970, and it says, like its successor in January 1973, spring 1970 was a period of great simultaneity. I'm not so sure I buy this woo of simultaneity. It just happens to be periods of time where a lot happens. And it can easily be linked or seen as the direct causal reason for next periods of a lot of things. So that's basically what it's saying, is that there was a cluster of activity in spring of 70 that is directly related to the cluster of activity that happened in January 73. That's the way I'm viewing it. So a lot of this has to do with Vietnam, and then the involvement of, or the implication of the way the North Vietnamese were using Cambodia as little sanctuary routes. And at the time, I guess there was a prince that I'm never going to be able to pronounce this, Norodom Sihanouk. He ended up being exiled. And Kissinger, who was, at least in Vietnam, Nixon's right-hand person, but whom Nixon was very, very jealous of, understood that if that exiled prince returned to power in Cambodia, it would be under communist domination, and that would make all of Cambodia an enemy sanctuary, just rather than these little spots. So this is during 1970, remember. This is in Nixon's first term. But right at the beginning of his first term, I'm going to read this section here because this is really interesting. It says, in June 1968, the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, who was then 77 years old, announced his desire to retire. He wrote to President Johnson, I have been advised that I am in as good physical condition as any person my age has any right to expect. The problem of age, however, is one that no man can combat, and therefore eventually must bow to it. So he said the problem was that Johnson was a lame duck. He had astounded friends and foes alike when he declared in late March 68 that he would not seek re-election. The war had worn him down, and he wanted to find a way to end it without the distractions of a presidential campaign. Then in April of 70, the movie Patton was released, and this movie ended up having like profound impact on Nixon, who watched it over and over and over again, kind of like me in the Hunger Games. Then later in April, Apollo 13 launched. Now remember, this is midway through Nixon's term. And then, that was also quite significant. Fortunately, and then there was the accident, but the astronauts did make it down safely. So Nixon flew to Honolulu, where he was greeted by Admiral John McCain, a name we all know. And it says on Sunday morning, April 19th, President Nixon met with McCain and his top commanders in the Pacific to talk about the widening crisis in Indochina. This fateful conference would turn out to have momentous consequences for the nation and the course of the war in Vietnam. Without the Apollo 13 near disaster, the meeting would never have taken place. A day after the McCain briefing, Nixon told Haldeman that he had made up his mind to take over responsibility for the war in Cambodia and would largely leave his cabinet out of it. But he also, at the same time, gave a speech that he would be withdrawing troops. And it says here, although Nixon knew the likelihood that he would expand the war into Cambodia, his troop withdrawal speech raised false expectations that Vietnamization, and that was slowly returning control to the Vietnamese people, and particularly to South Vietnam, and that the U.S. involvement was finally moving towards its terminus point. The backlash was now guaranteed to be all the more intense. And it's noted here that Nixon seemed to stay up ungodly hours and had this frenetic energy, and that it was nearly certain that he was being given some kind of stimulant by his physician. So on Sunday evening, April 26th, the final decision was made to invade Cambodia. It had been exactly 1 week since Nixon had been briefed by Admiral McCain in Hawaii. The nation was stunned. Students and campuses across the country came out in mass protest. And on Friday, May 1st, Nixon made the volatile situation much worse by offhandedly calling some of the student protesters bums. Then on May 2nd, the ROTC building at Kent State was burned to the ground. And then there was the killings at Kent State, which of course was all with the backdrop of Nixon previously calling student protesters bums. And Tom Wicker, a New York Times columnist, wrote that Nixon and Agnew's attacks on the Kent State victims could have no other purpose and no other result than to set generation against generation and class against class for the calculated political purposes of the Nixon administration. But later, in an effort to try to, like something sticky in my hair, tone down the outrage that was going on about his comments, Nixon said that he shared the objectives of the student protesters. He too wanted an end to the killing, an end to the war, and an end to the draft. But the difference was that he thought his moves in Cambodia would hasten the end of the war. But then, Dallas, Texas, May 22nd, 1970. Now this I found fascinating. On May 22nd, a hearing was held in the Federal District Court in Dallas on a woman's right to an abortion. The case was entitled Roe v. Wade. No witnesses would appear, no experts were called. Instead, the case was taken under advisement by a 3-judge panel after just 2 hours of oral argument by the lawyers. The hearing in Dallas took place exactly 10 days after Harry Blackmun was unanimously confirmed by the Senate. The scene was set for January 73. And Harry Blackmun was Nixon's third try at getting, because he had 2 vacancies to fill, this was the second vacancy, at getting someone confirmed. And Blackmun was almost an afterthought and turned out to be so key in the Roe v. Wade decision. So now we're on to chapter 1, entitled, "We've Got to Still Shoot Some Sparks." And that quote will come into play in a bit here. So we're back to 1973. Nixon desperately wanted a peace agreement with for Vietnam before his inauguration on January 20th. And the trial of the Watergate burglars was scheduled to begin in the second week of January, casting a menacing shadow that Nixon could not ignore. He was bedeviled by this scandal, this third-rate burglary that simply would not go away, even in the face of his landslide victory in November. By January 1974, only 1 year later, Judge John C. Sirica would be on the cover of Time as the Man of the Year, and Richard Nixon would be scrambling to explain an 18-and-a-half-minute gap in a White House tape recorded several days after the break-in. By then, Nixon's presidency would be in a death spiral. All of that seemed unfathomable as January 1st, 1973 began. Most of the president's advisors were out of town, enjoying the fruits of their hard work in the 1972 re-election campaign. Everyone assumed that the worst was behind them and that the second term would be less tempestuous than the first. Whew, famous last words. And woven throughout here is brief interludes talking about Nixon's opinions on football and his calls to coaches and stuff, which reminds us from Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72, how Dr. Thompson also mentioned that he shared some moments bonding, probably the only times he could bond with Nixon, over football. And also, in all of this, Martin Luther King Jr., who became convinced that the Vietnam War was one of the most unjust wars that have ever been fought in the history of the world. And he said, "The judgment of God is upon us. It is either nonviolence or non-existence." And 4 days later, he was dead after he said that. Now, it's talking about, it goes back to reflect on Nixon's reaction to his landslide victory. And it says, Nixon's contrary reaction to his stunning landslide began on election night. Henry Kissinger observed it. He wrote that Nixon had been seethed by a withdrawn and sullen hostility that had dominated his mood since the electoral triumph. Kissinger thought it was a strange mood, given the scale of Nixon's victory over Senator George McGovern, but there was no question that Richard Nixon seemed depressed and angry after his re-election. To Nixon, he was very peeved by McGovern's concession speech, and it seemed to him that McGovern was jutting out his jaw, acting defiantly, despite having just lost the election by near historic proportions. "This fellow to the last was a prick," Nixon complained to Henry Kissinger on the phone. Nixon had scored a landslide for sure, but his party had been largely rebuffed in the congressional elections. So the Congress, House and Senate, was controlled by the Democrats. So Nixon knew this meant trouble for his second term, despite his personal mandate. Given the massive split-ticket voting, Nixon recognized that his victory was more a reflection of disagreement with McGovern and his bug-out peace strategy than a decisive vote of confidence for him. And the election results shifted momentum in negotiations to the North Vietnamese. Nixon had miscalculated that he would have more leverage to negotiate peace after the election than before, but he was wrong. He would have been better off forcing the settlement before the election. And I'm skipping ahead to just these little vignettes. Nixon thought that the National Republican Party, run by Kansan Bob Dole, had been a disaster. And basically, the word Republican was anathema in the South. And he even talked about creating a new Republican Independent Party. And Nixon was getting very peevish with the press. He told the press, "You guys are now blaming McGovern's tactics for losing this. But that was simply not true, he said. His tactics didn't lose it, his issues lost it. For him, McGovern had lost because he stood for busing, amnesty, acid, and welfare. And remember, in Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, Hunter had said it was acid, amnesty, and abortion. These were the wedge issues, the reasons the country was dividing into two nations. A strong counter-revolution was underway, one based on fear and anger. Anger over forced desegregation, busing, and Supreme Court activism. Rage over draft dodging and the anti-war movement. Fear of the drug culture and crime. Fury over the freeloaders in society who took the money of hardworking Americans. In Nixon's mind, all of these threads, busing, amnesty, acid, and welfare, were wrapped around one overriding issue: patriotism. In other words, jingoism. The defense of America and its values. Nixon's gnawing concern right after the election was that he needed to avoid a mediocre second term. He knew from history that second terms could be lackluster at best, scandal-ridden at worst, and he had the granddaddy of all scandals. He had been carefully studying Robert Blake's nearly 845-page biography of Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative British Prime Minister and author. Disraeli observed in one of his speeches that the frenzied activities of a first term often leave government officials drained, without resolution or drive, burned out. Disraeli, according to Blake, was reminded of how he once spoke of governments being like marine landscapes, not very uncommon on the coast of South America. You behold a range of exhausted volcanoes. Nixon did not want his second term to be populated with exhausted volcanoes. Now check this out. What a dick. And his name was Richard. Thus, the morning after the election, 20 minutes after wrapping up his call with Harry Dent, Nixon met with his White House officials in the Roosevelt Room, the conference room just off the Oval Office. He told the story about Disraeli and exhausted volcanoes, and then left the room, leaving it to Haldeman to ask for everyone's resignation right after they helped him win. Haldeman recorded the gist of the encounter. Then he went into his Disraeli story about the exhausted volcano, Haldeman wrote. He said that it didn't apply to individuals, but it does apply to the entity, and that it's the responsibility of the leader to be sure we don't fall into that situation. We can't climb to the top and look down into the embers. We've got to still shoot some sparks, title of the chapter. Vitality and strength, and that we get some of that from new people, both in the cabinet and here on the staff. Haldeman followed the president's somber message by distributing mimeographed forms to everyone so they could list the documents in their possession as part of the resignation process. Henry Kissinger called the experience wounding and humiliating. The president's audience was dumbfounded. The very people who had just worked so hard on his re-election campaign were being unceremoniously shoved out the door. Victory seemed to have released a pent-up hostility so overwhelming that it would not wait even a week to surface. It engulfed colleagues and associates as well as its opponents, Kissinger wrote. One of the people in the Roosevelt Room that day was John Dean, the White House counsel. He was one of the few given advance word of the impending request for mass resignations, but he was assured not to worry. The administration needed Dean to hold things together as the Watergate cover-up entered a critical stage, with the trial of the burglar scheduled to begin in January 1973. And Nixon then went off to dictate a letter to the coach of the Dallas Cowboys. And it says, having attended to his correspondence, the president called Bull back in and asked him to locate Chuck Colson, one of the major conspirators. Colson showed up minutes later, chipper as usual. The conversation was about to turn conspiratorial, something both men enjoyed tremendously. Colson had news to dish on Henry Kissinger. And that is it for this portion. Really enjoying this.